This is DW News live from Berlin. Tonight, the plight of people in Gaza without water. With more than 1 million people crammed into the southern Gazan city of Rafah, even the most basic of needs are hard to meet. And with water in short supply, aid organizations are warning of an impending catastrophe. Also coming up tonight, the European Union agrees to slap new sanctions on Russia. The decision triggered by the death of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. Tonight we ask, will more sanctions, will they make any differences on the front lines in Ukraine? And the conflict in Myanmar spills over its borders into neighboring Bangladesh. Our correspondent talks to some of the people who've endured the violence and lost loved ones in the process. Plus, German football fans force the National League to scrap plans for private investment. After months of protests, the DFL is forced to back out of a multi-billion euro deal. We'll tell you why. I'm Brent Goff. To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the show tonight in the south of the Gaza Strip, where over 1 million displaced Palestinians are struggling to access even the basic needs for survival. In the city of Rafah, the biggest concern is water. With fresh water hard to come by, many are using seawater for much of daily life. Aid agencies say they are concerned that the lack of clean drinking water could soon lead to yet another catastrophe.
A frantic and daily routine in Rafah. Fetching clean water.
My son is small and needs water. I bring him seawater, but he refuses it. We're unable to wash. We don't have clean clothes. There's no water, there's no food. The rest of the world has food, but the situation here is dire. We need water to live. Without water, there is no life.
A long line forms every day on this beach. Around 1.5 million people are now believed to be crammed into the southern Gazan city of Rafah. Residents say the lack of clean water and food is causing disease to spread.
I've been standing here for an hour to collect water. All these people are waiting their turn, but not all of them will get water. Half of them will miss out. It's like this every day.
The World Food Programme has sounded the alarm once again about the gravity of conditions in Gaza.
Depending on where you are, it ranges from emergency levels, but it goes all the way up to catastrophic levels. You find that there are people who have missed meals for a day or 2 days or 3 days. They have severe hunger, but you also have people who have acute hunger. That is, they are not eating for a week.
Aid agencies say they're concerned about the possibility of famine in Gaza, a grim warning that comes as fighting continues.
And we stay in the Middle East, where the devastating war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza can mean life or death for journalists trying to cover the conflict there. Recent figures from the Committee to Protect Journalists show Palestinian journalists made up the majority of all journalists killed worldwide in the past year. Since Hamas's October 7th terror attacks in Israel, 83 Palestinian journalists and 2 Israeli journalists have been killed. Within the Gaza Strip, it's now almost exclusively Palestinians reporting on the war on the ground. Israel has refused to let foreign journalists in to report independently there. Jody Ginsburg is the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. I asked her what makes the conflict in Gaza so much more dangerous for journalists to report on compared to other conflicts.
This is the deadliest conflict for journalists that the Committee to Protect Journalists has ever documented. We've been doing this work for more than 30 years. More journalists died in the first 10 weeks of the Israel-Gaza war than have ever died, certainly since we've been doing this work in a single country over an entire year. The intensity, the numbers is absolutely unprecedented.
Your organization, we know, investigates the deaths of journalists in Gaza. I don't have to tell you, it's very difficult to verify any information that's coming out of the Gaza Strip. How do you make sure that the data you're collecting, that it's accurate?
It is extremely difficult. The sorts of things that we would normally rely on, being able to speak to families, being able to speak to colleagues, is extremely challenging because families are being killed, colleagues are being killed. Nevertheless, we take the same approach that we would with any other situation. We make sure that we have at least two sources of information for any of the journalists that we document. We speak to friends, we speak to families, we do research online that looks at their outputs to make sure that our information is as accurate as possible. And of course, it's a war. Information comes to light over time, and we update our information as we get it.
What do you say to the allegations that are coming from Israel that some of these journalists are militants? I mean, do you believe that they've actually been targeted by Israeli forces?
Well, we have yet to see any credible evidence that the journalists that the Israelis have said are actually militants or actually terrorists are such. Last year, before this war started, the Committee to Protect Journalists produced a report called Deadly Pattern, which looked at the killings of largely Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces over the past 22 years. And we found that 20 journalists had been killed, and in not a single case had anyone been held accountable. And what we saw, in fact, was a pattern in which quite often Israel was accused journalists of being terrorists, of being militants, but never produced any evidence. And that remains the case in this war too.
Israel says that its army cannot guarantee the safety of journalists. How can journalists then, how can they do their job without risking their lives?
Journalists in Gaza cannot do their jobs without risking their lives. Nowhere in Gaza is safe. Journalists are doing absolutely what we would expect journalists to do, covering a war. They're looking at the aftermath of bombings by going to hospitals, and then we see hospitals bombed, or they're going to refugee camps to look at the effects of displacement. Those have also been bombed. There isn't a place for journalists to be safe in the current environment. But it's absolutely imperative that we recognize that journalists are civilians and must be treated as such. So they must never be targeted.
Jody Ginsburg with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jody, we appreciate your time and your input tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to more sanctions against Russia. Today, the European Union agreed to a 13th round of sanctions against the Kremlin. The move comes as Russia's war against Ukraine nears its second anniversary, and it comes as Ukrainian forces are losing ground on the battlefield. Forces recently withdrew from the eastern town of Avdiivka after months of heavy fighting. This unverified Russian video that you're seeing right here, it purports to show soldiers there replacing the Ukrainian flag with their own. It also comes amid increasing repression inside Russia. The dissident Alexei Navalny, he died last Friday. That also played a part in Europe's decision to slap more sanctions against Russia. Professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld is the Senior Associate Dean at the Yale School of Business Management, and I asked him if this is the needed response, more sanctions, to the war in Ukraine and to the death of Alexei Navalny.
Yes, great question, and tragically great timing for your great question. It is needed. We've had various warning shots over the bow of increasingly stiff sanctions, and yet there's still more that has to be done. We alone had a lot to do with catalyzing the historic exit of 1,200 major multinationals to leave Russia. That's 6 times the retreat from South Africa in protest of the apartheid regime. And there are all kinds of sanctions, of course, as we know, in financial sector and some other sectors, but there's not enough. And this is, I think, going to be very effective. The oil price caps were pretty strong, but this will do even far more.
Professor, you will certainly understand there is a level of cynicism, though, among the public. This is the 13th round of sanctions that the European Union has slapped against Russia. How many rounds of sanctions will it take to get the desired outcome?
Well, it'll take a lot more, and it isn't like giving one weapon system either is going to do it. So please, I hope any cynical viewers keep in mind that the Leopard tanks from you folks or the Abrams tanks from here aren't going to do it alone. The HIMARS systems weren't going to do it alone. The F-16s weren't going to do it alone. The various kinds of Patriot missile systems and things provide protection and defense. But just like we need multiple weapon systems and now they're short on artillery, we also need a lot tighter sanctions. The sanctions have been very effective. What your viewers have to understand is Putin is concealing his economic statistics from the International Monetary Fund, from the IMF. Their own economists have told us, that the IMF, and we have it recorded, that they don't know how the Russian economy is doing. They're only taking his made-up propaganda, his statistics, and repackaging it. And Putin wakes up in the morning and comes up with a fake GDP. The Russian economy is hemorrhaging. Every sector is down from 60% to more than 90%. They have zero foreign investment going into it. They had over $100 billion a year of foreign direct investment going in there. We know that over a third of their millionaires have fled. The economy is in distress. But he's surviving because he's cannibalizing industry, and now this economy used to be 25% state controlled. It's now 70% state controlled. He uses it as his cookie jar. He's mortgaging Russia's future.
That may be the case, Professor, but it doesn't change the fact that these sanctions have not brought this war to an end, and that is what everyone is waiting to happen.
Well, they need even more. There are chips that get through. There are military-grade chips that even an ambassador from, just between we friends, Uzbekistan admitted to us directly, gets basically taped onto refrigerators and microwave ovens as household appliances that get imported into Russia that are actually harvested and used for military-grade uses. There are chips coming through Russia, chips coming through China, and those have to be tightened. The oil sanctions, Russia is not making money on oil. You hear about a volume of oil. Their profits have plunged. In fact, they're producing at break-even levels. And today's Financial Times reports what we said would happen 2 years ago, which is that Gazprom is basically virtually out of business. Nobody can buy their gas. You guys don't need it. The EU needs none of it. And he can't pivot and sell it to Asia. But there is still some slippage. We have aluminum is being bought. We have billions of dollars of aluminum, $10 billion of aluminum being bought by the EU. That should stop. $2 billion of titanium and things. That can be brought to a halt. And that's what these new sanctions will tighten, I think, the sanctions even more than and better enforcement on I think, some of the oil price caps would help.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be watching to see if this round will do the trick. Professor Jeffrey Zollenfeld, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, here's a look now at some of the other stories that are making headlines around the world. The United Kingdom has imposed sanctions on 6 members of Russia's prison authority. The 6 ran the Arctic penal colony where Alexei Navalny died last Friday. The UK has frozen their assets and imposed a travel ban on them. Police in several European countries have carried out raids on suspected members of a people smuggling gang involved in illegal migration across the English Channel. In Germany alone, the raids led to dozens of arrests. Europol coordinated the operations. Spanish farmers have fought with police at a demonstration in Madrid. Hundreds of tractors, you see them right there, rolled into the capital for fresh protests against what they see as excessive red tape and insufficient aid from the state. Farmers have been protesting for weeks now across many countries here in Europe. U.S. lawyers today urged a UK court to block WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's extradition appeal. Supporters of Assange protested outside of the London court. The court is deciding whether or not Assange should have yet another opportunity to argue against being extradited to the United States to face espionage charges. Our correspondent Birgit Maas, she was following the hearing at London's High Court. She had more on the arguments that were put to the court by U.S. attorneys who say Julian Assange should be extradited.
Well, they argued that Julian Assange is not a journalist and whatever he did was not covered by freedom of speech. They said, and this is an argument they have brought up to court before, they said that he brought people at risk, basically by publishing the information, the war logs, that he, what they said, had hundreds of Iraqis and Afghanis of sources that he put them at risk. This is something that Julian Assange's side deny. They say that could not be proven that he had done that. But the US basically maintained that what he's done is detrimental for the United States and also for these US sources. They also say that the UK should extradite Julian Assange because there has been long-standing friendship. The US is an ally of the United Kingdom, and that it should be basically taken for granted that they would act in good faith and that he would get a free and fair trial in the US.
And what's the thinking in the UK where you are, Birgit? I mean, how is Assange seen there?
It's really interesting. So these 2 days saw a lot of supporters of Julian Assange here just around me outside the courthouse. They were just chanting all day long, basically. There were the stages where MPs, human rights people, journalist organizations, where they were speaking in favor of Julian Assange. But his case is not covered intensively by UK media. So there is a bit of a disconnect. It's not that he's not covered at all, but I see media from around the world covering this case, but not so much in the UK. And equally, the people that have been here, they've been coming from as far as Australia. I've been speaking to Australians who come in his defense, and they are maintaining that this is such an important case because they see the freedom of the press at risk if Julian Assange is extradited and tried in the US.
DW correspondent Birgit Maas with the latest from London. And Birgit, thank you. Well, fighting between ethnic rebels and the military junta in Myanmar is spilling over into Bangladesh. You may remember that Myanmar's military took power back in February 2021 in a coup after ousting the civilian government of Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Since then, it has been fighting armed civilians and ethnic armed rebels. Well, recently, rebels took the fight to the army in many of Myanmar's states. One of those is Rakhine State on the border with Bangladesh. DW correspondent Arafatul Islam traveled to Gudum to speak to them.
Ibrahim lives just a short walk from the Myanmar border. He has often heard shelling and gunfire, but he never believed it would reach his doorstep.
I lost my mother. My mother could have been with me today, but she's not here with me because of a mortar shell from Myanmar's military that hit her. I don't know if I will get justice for my mother.
Ibrahim starts crying whenever he talks about his mother, Husniara Begum. She was killed by a shell that struck just as she was making lunch for her family. Begum lived around 800 meters from the border between the two countries. The explosion also killed a Rohingya man who worked at the house.
We started to hear the sounds of a lot of gunfire in the border area at the beginning of February. The sound was so loud that we couldn't sleep at night. Still, the local administration didn't pay attention to it. They didn't alert us. Had they warned us, we would have left the area and taken shelter elsewhere.
Villagers here can see the fighting right across the border in Myanmar's Rakhine State, where the Arkan army, an ethnic rebel group, has been battling Myanmar's junta forces for several years. But the violence hasn't stayed there. Locals here also say some rebels smuggle supplies across the border at night and the fighting has recently intensified. In February, the Arakan army took control of several border checkposts. Around 330 deserters from Myanmar's security forces fled into Bangladesh, trying to escape the fight. Within 2 weeks, Bangladesh handed them back over to Myanmar's junta authorities. But villagers say the border remains unprotected. Bangladeshi citizens living near the Myanmar border remain in fear as the sounds of gunfire and explosions in Myanmar continue. They think their government should engage in smart diplomacy to prevent any spillover effect from its neighbors' internal conflicts into its territory.
We are frightened because the Arakan army isn't the local government there. They captured it from the Myanmar army. If the army counterattacks, we will be the first victims.
We still hear gunshots around 2 to 3 a.m. We, the people at the border, are terrified now. 2 bullets hit my house as well.
We visited the Deputy Commissioner's office in Cox's Bazar to bring up the villagers' concerns. He said the government has beefed up border security but gave few details. Instead, he offered this advice.
Whenever it's felt that they have a security threat, we suggest they come to a safe place or a shelter.
Advice that offers little comfort to the people in Ghumdhum who say they now feel under threat all the time due to the violence next door.
Angry German soccer fans got what they wanted. The DFL, which runs the country's 2 top men's divisions, has abandoned a €1 billion foreign investor plan. Now, this follows months of protests by fans at matches. The fans were throwing objects onto the pitch. They were causing disruptions for months. They said that they feared the investment would lead to a further commercialization of the entire football industry. In a statement, a German Football League spokesman explained this decision.
At the end of the day, it boils down to democracy. Once you sense that it's lost the backing of the majority of the league association, then it's time to call it quits. It would have continued to divide the whole sport and its integrity, which really is the most important aspect. And the constant interruptions to the games, like it or not, those were the facts.
All right, I want to go now to Thomas Klinger. He is a sports journalist with the German public broadcaster Bayerischer Rundfunk. Thomas, it's good to have you with us. Listen, it's no secret German football is about a lot of money, not only about the game itself. So who was the investor clubs and the fans? What were they opposed to exactly here?
Well, the investors were originally 2. That was Blackstone and that is CVC. And CVC is one of the 10 biggest equity players in the world with lots of sports experience. But the players generally, or the fans generally, they don't want any investor. They have their more romantic idea of soccer, and that's what they want. No investor, and let's keep the ball rolling.
Let's keep the ball rolling. I mean, it's the fans, it's the clubs that have allowed German football to become a multi-billion euro business. Do you think the fans realize that, if you want to play in the big leagues, you have to pay in the big leagues?
Well, that's the weird thing. They want to win, but they want to play it at their own rules. But, the first thing is the DFL needed a 2/3 majority in December for the deal. And they made it a secret ballot. And that was sort of illegal and not transparent for the fans. And the fans wanted to get involved in the process. And that's why they kept up their head and said, okay, we're gonna fight to bring that agreement down.
I mean, so do you think this will have a positive impact, that there will be more transparency when it comes to the business of German football, or do you think this decision could have a downside?
There are both sides. First of all, we realize that in Germany, apparently we have a soccer democracy. That means a lot of the fans and a lot of input of the fans actually is taken a good stand in the public. And the DFL decided that they cannot go their way without the fans. So that is one of the good sides of it. On the other side is the investor would have paid €1 billion, and the DFL thinks that they need 600 million euros to invest in their model digitally and internationally. And that money is lacking. And now the clubs and the DFL have to find a way to get the money otherwise.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You know, they say money talks, and I think in this case, the fans were able to talk a little bit more loudly. Sports journalist Thomas Klinger. Thomas, we appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, here's a reminder now of our top stories. The European Union has agreed to a 13th round of sanctions against Russia. It comes as the Kremlin's war against Ukraine nears its second anniversary, and it comes as Ukrainian forces are losing ground on the battlefield. Its forces recently withdrew from the eastern town of Avdiivka after months of heavy fighting. You're watching DW News. After a short break, I'll be back to take you through the day. Stick around. We will be right back.